Well, I'm Thom in Washington, D.C., and here's what's coming up tonight on The Big Picture. A new study shows that when Americans don't have enough time or energy to give thought to a particular political issue, they tend to accept the conservative argument more often. But what exactly is the conservative argument nowadays in America? Also, Scott Walker's war on labor was dealt a major blow last week as his anti-union law was declared unconstitutional. While he prepares for the political fight of his life, how might this ruling affect his chances of surviving a recall election in the Badger State? And corporations in America used to care about the best interests of their communities and country, but the role in society has changed. How have corporations become predatory monsters, preying on Americans and our wallets? To know this. With Mitt Romney way ahead in the polls in Wisconsin, which holds its primary on Tuesday, it's looking more and more like the Republican primary is wrapped up. Calls for Rick Santorum to gracefully drop out of the race are growing louder, and President Obama's re-election team is now focusing solely on Wall Street's favorite guy, Mitt Romney. Early polls indicate that Romney will need a lot of billionaire money, however, to defeat the president in November. Among registered voters nationwide, President Obama leads Romney 49 to 45%. In the 12 crucial swing states, President Obama leads 51 to 42%. And thanks to Romney's support for the Republican war on women, President Obama now has opened up an 18-point lead among female voters. But none of these numbers account for the super PAC spending blitz that the Republican Party's millionaires and billionaires are preparing for the general election. Already, the most notorious oil oligarchs on the right, the billionaire Koch brothers, just dipped into their war chests to help fund a $3.6 million ad campaign around the nation to blame the president for rising gas prices.
Since Obama became president, gas prices have nearly doubled. Obama opposed exploring for energy in Alaska. He gave millions of tax dollars to Solyndra, which then went bankrupt. And he blocked the Keystone Pipeline, so we will all pay more at the pump. Obama's energy secretary said we need to, quote, boost the price of gasoline to the levels in Europe. That's $9 a gallon. But what does he care?
I don't own a car at the moment.
Tell Obama we can't afford his failing energy policies.
The cost of that ad was just part of the $500 million in corporate cash that the Koch brothers and other American oligarchs pledged to commit to the 2012 election to defeat President Obama. But there's also something else that might be working against progressives. A new study out of the University of Arkansas suggests that conservatism might be the nation's default ideology. The researchers found that when Americans don't have enough time or energy to give sufficient thought to a particular political issue, they tend to accept the conservative argument more often. But that raises another question. What exactly is conservatism in America? What is a conservative? Russell Kirk, the founder of the modern conservative movement, in his famous essay, The Essence of Conservatism, wrote, "A conservative is not, by definition, a selfish or a stupid person. Instead, he's a person who believes there's something in our life worth saving. Conservatism, indeed, is a word with an old and honorable meaning, but a meaning almost forgotten by Americans until recent years. Abraham Lincoln wished to be known as a conservative. What is conservatism, he said? Is it not preference for the old and tried over the new and untried? Yeah, could be. This man was a true conservative, Dwight Eisenhower. Through the 8 years of his administration, he ended an ill-conceived war in Korea and didn't start any more. He worked hard to preserve the institutions of America that had gotten us out of the Republican Great Depression and were successfully building the strongest middle class the world had ever seen. He knew that Social Security was tried and true, to use Russell Kirk's, or paraphrase Russell Kirk, and he strengthened it. He knew that unemployment insurance was tried and true, and he kept it. He knew that literally thousands of years of experience of labor unions making an economy strong, all the way back to the ancient stonemasons, was tried and true, so he supported them. He knew that 2 centuries of American experience, and that of civilized nations around the world, showed that a functional federal government that operated within modest boundaries was tried and true, and he even wrote about it. President Eisenhower wrote a letter about this to his brother Edgar in 1954 during the third year of his presidency, about how this sort of moderate conservatism worked. He wrote that to attain any success, it is quite clear that the federal government cannot avoid or escape responsibilities which the mass of the people firmly believe should be undertaken by it. The political processes of our country are such that if a rule of reason is not applied in this effort, we will lose everything, even to a possible and drastic change in the Constitution. This is what I mean by my constant insistence upon moderation in government. Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. There is a tiny splinter group, of course, that believes you can do these things. Among them are H.L. Hunt, you possibly know his background, and a few other Texas oil millionaires, and an occasional politician or businessman from other areas. But their number is negligible, and they are stupid. End a quote from Dwight Eisenhower. That was a real conservative, recognizing what worked for the American people and wanting to conserve it. Now, these guys are not conservatives. They're radicals. They want to destroy the tried and true: Social Security, the minimum wage, child labor laws, the right to unionize, Medicare, progressive taxation, antitrust laws that protect small businesses and small farmers. And they want to replace it all with a wildly radical libertarian experiment that has never, ever worked in any nation in the history of the world. They want to turn our entire nation over to the unrestrained bankers on Wall Street and the oil billionaires like the Koch brothers who fund their type. These radicals are pushing austerity here in the U.S., just like radicals in Europe are pushing austerity in Greece, Spain, and the UK, with disastrous results. When Eisenhower came into office in 1952, he was faced with the Korean War and a massive budget deficit left over from World War II. After World War II, right now, our deficit is about between 80 and 90% of GDP. When World War II ended, it was 127% of GDP. What did Eisenhower do? He ended the war with Korea. He paid down the budget deficit. But how? Well, he had a 91% tax rate on billionaires, today's dollar billionaires. He had a 35% tax rate on corporations, and corporations actually paid over 30% of all the revenue for operating the federal government. Now it's about 11%. He borrowed and spent billions on infrastructure. He built an interstate highway system, schools, and hospitals across this nation. That investment generated so many good jobs and so much growth, so many people making a good wage, that the tax revenues flowing into our government paid down the debt. So where are the real conservatives who want to conserve what works today? Republican Olympia Snowe. She's decided not to run for re-election. Chuck Hagel similarly decided to leave the Senate. Senators Jim Jeffords and Arlen Specter left the Republican Party. And the standard bearer of the radical Republicans, George W. Bush, nearly destroyed the entire world's economic system with his radical deregulation agenda that turned the banksters loose. And then in 2005, he actually blocked state attorneys general from trying to regulate them. Republicans, take back your party, please. And true conservatives, take back your movement from the neocons and the radicals. But in the meantime, what kind of conservative platform will Mitt Romney run on? Here to offer his take on this is Mike Slater, conservative commentator and host of the Mike Slater Radio Show, weekday mornings in San Diego, and Mike Slater, young conservative, on Sirius XM Radio. Mike, welcome.
Hey, good morning, Tom. And beautiful monologue. I disagree with 99% of it, and I wish we could talk more extensively about all of it, but really great stuff.
Well, it's all historically accurate, Mike. It's pretty straightforward stuff.
Well, I mean, there's so much historical revision. It's hard to even pick one point in there in particular. But you say the Republicans need to take back their party, or conservatives need to take back the Republican Party. It used to be the Democratic Party that was the party of limited government. Now they're the party of big government. And I agree with you, conservatives need to change how they behave and change how they govern, but they need to do that by being smaller, not by being more progressive.
So you want to shrink the size of government so that the Koch brothers will have more power and more influence, so that big industry in America will have more power over our lives, so that big ISPs can snoop on us, so that big phone companies can charge us more. You want to just turn the whole thing over to the big corporations.
First of all, you act like only the Koch brothers are the only
Mike,
people
on
the conservative side.
People say, you guys say, do you want the government to regulate your health care? Well, I don't want United Healthcare to regulate my health care. Those are the choice.
First, well, it's not the choice. Free market is about competition and options. If you think that you can provide health insurance at a lower cost than someone else, you are free to start that company. If the government takes it over and they're in charge, then there are no choices. There is no market.
You ever been to a football game, Mike?
But, I mean, there's so. Oh, I'm sorry?
You ever been to a football game?
Absolutely.
How do you think it would go if there were no referees and whichever team had the most money could move the goalposts anytime they wanted?
Tom, that's a very clever analogy there, but that doesn't quite work when we're talking about free markets.
That's government. There is no such thing as a free market. Marketplaces are created by government. Government creates the currency. Government creates the laws. Government has the court system that enforces the laws. Government has the jails for those people who don't comply with them. Markets are created by government. There is no such thing as a free market. You've got Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan trying to destroy government in this country. How is Mitt Romney going to succeed when the voters realize that millions of them are going to lose their health insurance and that elderly people are going to somehow have to find a health insurance company, a for-profit health insurance company that'll insure them with their little voucher, and meanwhile you guys handed off $3 trillion to the rich?
Tom, you can't frame a question like that. You can't answer that because it's not a real question. I mean, if you want to talk about health care, we could talk about free market ways to make health care more affordable for more people if you want. I mean, if you want to talk about the budget in general, I think the only real winning proposition that Romney has is to decrease the amount of government spending. Here's just an example. The Iraq and Afghanistan war currently cost $143 million a year. And I'm against it. And I'm no fan of Mitt Romney either, but hear me out. $143 million a year to fight these wars that we shouldn't be fighting. Just the interest on our debt alone is $440
a debt, Mike, we're out of time, but it's a debt that, three-quarters of was run up by 3 Republican presidents. But
so
Mike, we're out of time.
Tom,
we will continue this conversation. We will, absolutely.
Well, let's end it agreeing that we should get rid of our debt. Left and right, we can all agree on that one.
Yeah, maybe. Thanks a lot, Mike. While progressives may be optimistic now, the truth is there's a tidal wave of oil in Wall Street, billionaire cash coming to destroy Obama and drown out the voices of we the people. The only way to counteract that wave of cash is for all of us to get involved and active. Just like true conservatives need to take back their party, progressives need to organize and take back the Democratic Party as well. We'll be right back.
We just put a picture of me when I was like 9 years old on To Tell the Truth.
I have a confession. I am a total ghetto princess. I love rap and hip-hop music and Christian music.
I thought he was kind of a dick yesterday.
I'm very proud of the role that Al Jazeera has played.
You know how sometimes you see a story and it seems so whole and complete, you think you understand it, and then you glimpse something else. You hear or see some other part of it and realize everything you thought you knew, you don't know? I'm Thom Hartman. Welcome to The Big Picture.
Gus, the rest of the news. More than a year ago, Governor Scott Walker created a firestorm in Wisconsin with his anti-union law known today as Act 10. It subsequently led to over 1 million signatures being turned in to have Governor Walker recalled from office. But now it turns out that Act 10 is itself unconstitutional. A federal judge last week ruled that Walker's anti-union law, which limits collective bargaining rights and forces public unions to recertify once a year, violates a number of our rights under the Constitution. In a strictly political move, Walker exempted police and firefighters from the anti-union law, for example, giving grounds for the court last week to strike down the law because it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. The court also said it violates public workers' First Amendment rights. So Walker's wildly unpopular war against unions might all be for naught. And as he prepares for the political fight of his life in a recall election, how might this now unconstitutional law affect his chances of winning? For the latest coming out of the Badger State, Graham Zielinski is here. He's communications director of the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. Graham, welcome.
Good evening, Tom. Thank you.
Great to have you back with us. What's your take on the court striking down this law?
Well, I don't think Scott Walker or the Republicans who passed it cared about the constitutionality of it at the time. Everyone and their mother could see that this was an unconstitutional law. It violated the rights of association. It treated certain unions different than others. I mean, it was a rotten law to begin with, and not least of which was because it went and was most concerned with attacking the rights of people to bargain collectively. Here, the court struck down the process that required these unions to recertify every year and their ability to collect dues, which Scott Walker was trying to get rid of. But fundamentally, at the heart of it, we've seen since the law passed, Wisconsin led the nation in job loss. We did not only led the nation in job loss, we led the nation in political division. His government was almost entirely paralyzed because of this governor. And it all came from this rotten act, which we knew to be unconstitutional then, which we have heard is unconstitutional now. But there's a redress. Like, as you said before, the citizens of Wisconsin, more than 1 million strong, affixed their name to a petition to recall Scott Walker. And we're not going to just be talking about Act 10 as we go into this recall election. We're going to be talking about a criminal corruption probe that grows closer and closer to Scott Walker. We're going to be talking about what he did to damage public education and what he did fundamentally to damage the trust of the people of Wisconsin.
Graham, we've seen in state after state laws that were written by lawyers for the Koch brothers or lawyers for big corporations or corporate lobbyists that go through the Koch brother-funded American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. And, there are some startling similarities between, or it appears to me anyway, between the Wisconsin anti-union law and John Kasich's anti-union law, although John Kasich didn't exempt police and firefighters. Do you know, or is there any evidence that these laws came out of the same source or from the same pot, and that maybe Scott Walker just tweaked it because he thought he needed the help of the police and firefighters, whereas in Ohio perhaps Kasich didn't need that help because there's no provision in Ohio law for recalling a governor?
There is no question. There is absolutely zero question that the Koch brothers funded groups, the Bradley Foundation, all these groups are behind Scott Walker. It's who he listens to. And we know that because we have the tape. We know that because David Koch himself has said that he is supporting Scott Walker through all these phony 501c3, 501c4 groups that we believe are illegally coordinating. They set up as nonprofits, not-for-profits, and then they go ahead and they put ads that are exactly coordinated with Scott Walker's campaign message, exactly coordinated with the Tea Party Republicans. They put out these phony organs, like ALEC is one of them, but they also have these fake news organizations in Wisconsin. We call them a Wisconsin Reporter, the McIver Institute, all these fake and phony things that are meant to fool the public into believing that this is in their interest. You are exactly right to point out the corporate forces behind Scott Walker, and the irony is he goes everywhere and tells the lie that these are out-of-state forces are coming against him. He is going to outspend us 10 to 1, 11 to 1, 12 to 1 in this election. And it's all coming from places like New York, Texas, Missouri, places that have no interest in the success or the failure of the working families of Wisconsin. They do have a rooting interest in these corporations that want to see wages, benefits, and rights driven into the dirt so they get a couple more pennies on the dollar in return.
Amazing. Graham Zielinski, thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Yeah, don't forget us. So wisdems.org. Please go there to see what you can do to help.
You got it. Wisdems, W-I-S, like Wisconsin, Dems, wisdems.org. Thank you, Graham. Now, from millionaires and billionaires buying democracy in Wisconsin to millionaires and billionaires not paying their fair share in taxes all across America. According to the Congressional Budget Office, corporations are paying less in taxes in America now than they've paid in over 40 years. Despite American corporations making enormous profits last year, they're second best in a generation. They paid on an average only 12.1% in federal taxes in 2011. That's far below the 35% corporate tax rate that conservatives claim is crippling business in America. At 12.1%, American corporations are paying the lowest taxes in the entire developed world. It's also a staggering drop-off since the last quarter century, between 1987 and 2008, when corporations paid an average of 25.6% as a corporate tax rate. And as this chart shows, when corporations and the very, very wealthy are not paying their fair share in taxes, guess who has to pick up the slack? Working people. Notice as corporate tax revenue, represented in the blue, drops, then payroll taxes, represented in the purple, which are paid entirely by working people, go up. That's one reason why the United States has one of the highest levels of wealth inequality in the developed world, and why the middle class is disappearing right in front of our eyes. But there's a bigger picture here, and that is the role of corporations in America has changed since basically Reagan and Reaganomics. Where once corporations used to be tuned in to what is in the best interests of their communities and country, they're now tuned in to only what's most profitable, even when that profit comes at the expense of their communities or their nation. They become predators. For more on this, Lynn Paramore joins me now. She's a contributing editor alternate, founder of New Deal 2.0, and author of the book Reading the Sphinx. Lynn, welcome.
Good to be here.
Thanks for joining us. How have corporations managed to get by not paying their fair share in taxes?
Well, we've got a relationship between corporations and the public that is seriously out of balance, and this ridiculous tax situation that you just mentioned is one of the symptoms. I mean, in 2008, Goldman Sachs, which received a massive bailout that same year and also made massive profits, paid 1.1% in taxes. And, you know, we'll hear from conservatives that, you know, these corporations don't really owe us anything. They're job creators, blah, blah, blah. Well, they actually owe the public quite a bit, and we need to remember that, and we need to blast through this mythology that's been handed to us for the last 30 years by conservatives and neoliberal economists. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we pay a tremendous amount for corporations to have their workforce educated. We pay for infrastructure that allows them to do their business. In the case of a company like Goldman Sachs, we pay tremendous amounts in defense spending so that they can have safe markets in foreign countries and have new markets opened up for them. So this idea that they don't owe us anything is absolute hogwash.
And yet, with all of that, you've got conservatives who every day, you know, thousands, tens of thousands of hours of conservative talk radio, an entire television network devoted to it, newspapers, everything, where there's like, it's accepted conventional wisdom that corporate taxes are too high and they're destroying America and they're the reason why Apple's sitting on tens of billions of dollars overseas. How do they get away with this?
Yeah. Yeah, they've managed to convince us that, you know, there's some kind of wall of separation between the public sphere and the private sphere. I mean, this is nonsense. People have forgotten that a public corporation, there's a word in that phrase, which is public. It's not private enterprise. These are publicly traded companies, and they have responsibilities to the public. One of the things that's so outrageous that's changed in the last few decades is the financialization of corporations, and by that we mean the focus on short-term profits and the boosting of company shares over any other, investment in, say, workers, for example. And the ideology behind that, which has been promoted at business schools now for several decades, is that shareholders are the ones who bear the risk and aren't guaranteed any return. And that is utter nonsense. Lots of people bear the risk. The government bears the risk when it uses our money, our taxpayer money, to invest in all kinds of things that allow corporations to be productive and to conduct their business. And they're not guaranteed any return. Workers are invested in, creating new products for a company well above and beyond what they're paid in some cases. They're not guaranteed any return. So all of this is just nonsense. It's a misguided ideology that has allowed corporations to turn on the 99%. And as you put it, they have become predators instead of productive members of society. And they need to be held accountable. And I have to say, it's not going to be an easy thing to do. At this point, if you're a voter, it's hard to know who to vote for. There are entrenched corporate interests on both sides of the political aisle. It's probably going to take a mass movement to turn this around and to have a real paradigm shift. And fortunately, we've seen Occupy Wall Street sort of opening the door to that. But the public really needs to wake up. And we need to remember, these corporations owe us. The CEOs of those corporations work for us. And we are stakeholders, and we have a right to determine how they conduct business. In Germany, for example, workers and taxpayers actually sit on the boards of public corporations. That would be a very instrumental, a key change that we could make in the United States. Let's have some of the people who are stakeholders, in Goldman Sachs sit on their boards and help make the decisions about how that company is going to allocate its resources.
Yeah, this is actually German law that any corporation that has more than 1,000 employees has to have half of the members of their board of directors coming from organized labor, from representatives of the people who work for that company. It would be a great start. Lynn, thanks so much for being with us tonight. I appreciate it, and for the brilliant, brilliant writing over at Alternate.
My pleasure.
Very glad to have you with us. Ending the corporate domination of our economy really begins with getting rid of corporate personhood. This bizarre notion that the Supreme Court came up with. Actually, it's got two pieces. One, that money is not property, it's speech. It came out of the Buckley case and others. And the other, that corporations are not these things that are created by the law, they're persons. Right? To find out how to get more involved in that movement to end corporate personhood, go to movetoamend.org or freespeechforpeople.org. After the break, how did a false alarm call to the police lead to a violent show of force and the death of a harmless and elderly African-American man?
We just put a picture of me when I was like 9 years old on To Tell the Truth.
Confession, I am a total ghetto princess. I love rap and hip-hop music and Christian music.
Thought he was kind of a dick yesterday.
I'm very proud of the role that Al Jazeera has played.
You know how sometimes you see a story and it seems so whole and complete, you think you understand it, and then you glimpse something else. You hear or see some other part of it and realize everything you thought you knew, you don't know? I'm Thom Hartman. Welcome to The Big Picture.
Welcome back to The Big Picture. I'm Thom Hartman. Coming up in this half hour, an elderly African-American man accidentally calls for medical help and ends up being shot dead in his own home. So how did a false alarm turn into a senseless death? And in tonight's Daily Take, the fear machine is tearing apart American society. How can we turn it off and return America to the land of the free and the home of the brave? With the nation still trying to figure out what happened in Sanford, Florida that led to the death of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin back in February, and why George Zimmerman is still walking around as a free man, a new and just as disturbing case is coming to light out of New York. It was there that a 68-year-old African-American man was gunned down in his own home by police officers who were responding to a false alarm. Ken Chamberlain Sr., a former Marine who suffered from a heart condition, had a medical alert system pendant, what when pressed would call for emergency medical help. Somehow, Chamberlain's medical alert system was triggered, leading to an ambulance being dispatched to his home, along with several police cruisers. Upon arriving at the scene, the police attempted to enter Chamberlain's home, but Chamberlain, who insisted he was feeling fine, refused to let them in. But police snapped the locks on the front door and barged in on a clearly distressed Chamberlain. Officers fired tasers and beanbag rounds at the 68-year-old man, and then, according to police reports, Chamberlain reached for a knife in his kitchen and was promptly gunned down by 2 bullets in the chest. He died in the hospital. So how did this false alarm turn into a violent police response that led to the death of an African-American senior citizen? Is this about race, excessive police force, or both? Hillary Shelton joins me now. He's the Washington Bureau Director and Senior Vice President for Advocacy and Policy at the NAACP. Hillary, welcome back.
Hey, Tom, it's great to be with you.
Mr. Shelton.
Oh, no, please, Hillary.
It's great to have you there. First of all, Trayvon Martin, just the, I'm sorry? Just, you know, wrapping that up, if we could, what's the latest with that story?
Well, as things are now, our hope is that charges are being prepared against Mr. Zimmerman. And very clearly, I think as most of us have listened to the evidence made available as it's unfolded, we see that there's no reason that formal charges for murder have not been brought against Mr. Zimmerman under these circumstances. Of course, what we have again is a 17-year-old youth that was walking back from a 7-Eleven, picking up a bag of Skittles and a can of Arizona iced tea, talking to his girlfriend on the phone. Mr. Zimmerman sees him applying the same old racial profiling strategies that we've heard so often, determined that because he's a young African-American man, he's wearing a hoodie and pulled his hood over his head as it was lightly drizzling outside, that somehow or another he must have just committed some kind of crime or on his way to commit some crime. Deciding that even after speaking to the law enforcement officials, calling 911 on Mr. Martin, telling them that there's this man walking around that looks very suspicious, but not saying why he's suspicious, not saying why it's a problem, saying that he's going to pursue him. They ask him to stand down. He goes after him anyway. They're going to send a cruiser out from the police department. He ends up dead, and Mr. Zimmerman goes to jail for just a minute to be questioned. But for some reason, because of either an interpretation or because of the way the Stand Your Ground law was written, it's okay for someone to taunt someone, to target someone, and then to shoot them to death on the streets and then get off.
Chase them.
No, absolutely. Yeah. So it's our hope now that the Justice Department's got involved. Now that we have someone actually watching over a police department that's clearly flubbed so much along the way, that perhaps justice can be served, charges will be brought, and they will also get their day in court.
Today, the people who had done the forensics on the audio tape of one of the neighbors who had dialed 911, and you can hear the help, help shouting in the background, did the tape, and Zimmerman has been claiming, the shooter has been claiming that that was him yelling for help, and they said 99% certainty we will testify under oath in court to it. This was not Zimmerman's voice.
It's glad to have this substantiated, because quite frankly, for those of us who happen to be fathers of teenage sons, and in my case, I have a 17-year-old son, that I've had to have that discussion about what to do when you're confronted with the police or when somebody confronts you along these lines, how you have to be on a different kind of behavior and respond to that kind of thing. When I heard those voices screaming, when I heard the earlier 911 tapes, their screams for help, 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 it went on until that shot was fired, and then it was silenced forever. When I heard that sound, I knew that was a 17-year-old, a teenage kid. Yeah. But those of us who have teenage children, we know that our boys in that age grouping are just getting beyond those voice changes, just having gone through those puberty changes and whatnot. But when they become excited and frantic along those lines, that old crackling we hear during those early teen years, 13 and 14, comes back. Yeah. You could hear that in that tape. I would have been absolutely floored if somehow or another that voice that I heard over the television of the recordings of those 911 tapes was anything other than a teenage boy.
I have had virtually every African-American of my age, or parenting age, with whom I've talked about this, has told me the story of a conversation that they've had with their kids, and I've had a number of young people call into my radio show telling me about the conversation that their parents had with them. And nowadays, I mean, this is a different generation than it was in the 50s, 60s, 70s, but it's still there. Absolutely. And I've had young African Americans call the program and say, when my dad first brought this up with me, I thought, this is nonsense. It's not.
No, not at all.
I don't think most of our white viewers, at least those who have not grown up close to the African American community, have any idea what you and I are talking about right now, about that conversation that African American parents have with their kids. Can you tell me about that?
Sure. It's the issue I think many take for granted. It's one I wish we could. It's the one that we recognize that for some reason or another, as we look at how things have moved throughout our society, that African Americans, again, to some, actually lowers the threshold for what is threatening. That is, if an African American raises their voice in righteous indignation, somehow it's perceived as the next step to a violent attack. That if we're stopped on the streets by a police officer and we know we haven't done anything wrong and we perceive that it might be the practice of racial profiling, for us to question is somehow seen as the preparation for an assault. So we have to talk to our children about how important it is when you're driving down, so if you get pulled over, keep your hands in plain view. Don't make any fast moves. We have to tell them how important it is for them not to raise their voice and not to even plead their case, but to simply talk to the police officer as respectfully as possible. But what I tell my sons is also process in your mind two things: that badge number and also process that name tag on their shirts. They're not going to be able to do anything for you at that point. But you come back and talk to us, and then we'll address it then. But make sure you're able to come back and talk to us. We've seen too many cases where African-American young people were dealt with as if they were some kind of violent criminal because of the perception based on the color of their skin. But I'll tell you this, if we were able to make those transitions and show Americans what someone looked like with a different skin color going through the same thing, I believe we'd be much more outraged than we are. It's unfortunate that we have to have this conversation, but for parents like me, there really is the feeling that if we don't, it's a dereliction of our responsibilities as parents. We need our children to come home. We need them not to be another Trayvon Martin.
And this is a conversation that white parents, frankly, speaking as one, never felt the need to have with their kids. And
that's a wonderful thing.
That's the incredible divide in America.
I hope we can get everyone to that point, that we recognize that this is happening. It's not a figment of our imagination. These things happen to our children under those circumstances. There are still cases that go back. If you think about for a minute, even Amadou Diallo in New York City. What you have is...
wallet.
Thank you.
Armed with a wallet.
Somehow a wallet and a door key magically transform into a gun. Police officers are able to let go with 42 shots, hitting him 21 times, killing him. But when they go before the judge and jury, the thing that's even more outrageous is the police officers cry and say, we felt threatened. But somehow or another, because that man was black, they said, well, we understand.
I think
after they cried, they got off.
This is the echo of Emmett Till. And Emmett Till is the echo of, all the way back to the 1600s.
Absolutely.
We have just a minute or so left, and we haven't yet talked about Mr. Chamberlain.
Yes, indeed.
The 68-year-old man. Your thoughts on that?
Well, actually, what we have in this case is a man that the police came to see about, along with the medical service providers.
Former Marine.
Former Marine. He's in his apartment. Somehow or another, his medical alert alarm goes off. They come to his door. He tells them he doesn't need them. Actually, a discussion went on between he on the inside and the police officer and the medical alert staff on the outside for about an hour. He actually called medical alert and told them, I don't need any help. Send them away. I didn't set this off, at least not on purpose, and I don't need anything. After an hour of them saying, we want to see you, so I don't want to deal with you. They kick the door down, they come in, they tase him, and then decide to shoot him to death. There's something really wrong with the perception of threat they had for him under those circumstances. Yeah. Here you have a 68-year-old African-American standing there literally in his boxer shorts, but shot to death by police officers. Two 40-millimeter shots to the chest. That is outrageous. We should all be concerned about what happens on his own property by those that are paid to serve and protect.
Hillary, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
It's my pleasure.
Keep up the good work and spread the good word. We need to all be wary of police power in America. The idea to protect and serve has been lost, and people are dying. Crazy alert. What are the odds? Bill Isles, a 48-year-old Wichita, Kansas man, bought a ticket for Friday's Mega Millions lottery jackpot. And like most Americans, he didn't win a single penny. But he did get struck by lightning just hours after purchasing the tickets. Isles, a trained storm spotter, was reporting on a storm when he was struck by lightning outside his home. Isles told a local television network that his whole body started twitching. However, he did not suffer any major burns.
So you're going to have some things with my memory that are going to bother me for a while, but I wasn't burned. I had a little bit of an irregular heartbeat.
He had a 1 in 176 million chance of winning Mega Millions on Friday. He had a 1 in 775,000 chance of being struck by lightning this year. I guess he cashed in on the lightning strike odds. Isles' story gives new meaning to the old adage, you have a better chance of getting struck by lightning than winning the lottery. Coming up in tonight's Daily Take on Sunday night, a homemade explosive device was detonated outside a window of a Planned Parenthood office in Wisconsin. But you haven't heard a peep about it from the mainstream media. Why? I'll tell you after the break.
We just put a picture of me when I was like 9 years old on To Tell the Truth.
I have a confession. I am a total ghetto princess. I love rap and hip-hop music and Christian music.
I thought he was kind of a dick yesterday.
I'm very proud of the role that Al Jazeera has played.
You know how sometimes you see a story and it seems so whole and complete, you think you understand it, and then you glimpse something else. You hear or see some other part of it and realize everything you thought you knew, you don't know? I'm Thom Hartman. Welcome to The Big Picture.
Your Take, My Take is your chance to send in your questions, comments, rants, and observations about anything we talk about here on The Big Picture or during my radio show. Our first comment tonight comes from Daniel in Federal Way, Washington. He called into our viewer rant line and had this interesting take on the Trayvon Martin tragedy.
Hey, Tom, this is Daniel. I just want to let you know, in the Trayvon Martin case, George Zimmerman has claimed that Trayvon Martin, as he attacked him, made several cheesy one-line statements to him, things like, you got a problem with me? You do now. And you're going to die tonight. And after Zimmerman shot Trayvon Martin, he claims that Trayvon kind of stood back and went, you got me. I just want to let you know that in concealed pistol license slaying cases, which I've read up a lot on, silly statements like this on the part of the shooter, the concealed pistol license guy, are very common. It's a way that they make their slayings look legitimate, regardless of whether they are legitimate or not. So when you read concealed case histories and files on what the shooter claimed happened that night, right before the so-called bad guy attacks him, in almost every case you read that the bad guy will have conveniently said something like, you're going to die now, or I'm going to kill you, or something like that. And it's basically something that concealed pistol license people learn from books and magazines they read that teach them not only how to kill people effectively, but also what to say to the police after the slaying is done. Just thought you'd like to know about that. Thanks. Bye.
You know, my guess is that it isn't so much that there's like, you know, a secret society of concealed carry people who all know the magic words to say to the police after they've killed somebody, as it is that George Zimmerman and a lot of men in particular in the United States grew up as little boys watching Westerns and watching Matt Dillon and watching Dirty Harry, whatever it may be, whatever era they came from. And, you know, seeing men use guns as a way of achieving power. And when you combine, because a gun is real power. I mean, they're fairly heavy, and they represent instant death. That's the power of life or death. That's the greatest power there is. And when you combine a person who feels fundamentally disempowered, somebody who feels like their life isn't working, they got a crummy job, nobody likes them, they're a little weird, whatever, with that power of life or death in their hand, I think that they, more often than not, may well kind of step into that comic book world, that childhood world that they grew up in, and that probably accounts for those kind of comments. Just my opinion. Our final comment of the night comes from Gavin in the United Kingdom. He posted this on our ThomHartman.com message boards. I'm sure glad we don't have people walking around with guns like in the States. I really don't see the reason for people to have the right to own single-use instruments of death. Yeah, if I come up against criminals, I'd much prefer they didn't have guns like most of them in England. And, you know, it's a fine thing in England that most of your criminals don't have guns. In fact, you know, when I was a kid growing up, your police didn't have guns. Wouldn't it be extraordinary if the world was more civilized? If we didn't have this incredible armaments industry, literally worldwide, that is making, I mean, there's far more guns than there are people on the planet. It's really quite extraordinary. You look at countries that actually have strong gun control laws, countries like Japan, and, you know, very, very much lower rates of violence, particularly gun violence like that. Anyhow, that's it for Your Take, My Take tonight. If you'd like your comments and questions heard on this segment of The Big Picture, listen up.
We want to know your take. Send us your comments by visiting the Thom Hartman Facebook page, via Twitter at Thom_Hartman, or in the chat room on the message boards or through the blog at ThomHartman.com. You can also leave a message on our rant line at 202-536-5306. Agree, disagree, sound off? It's all welcome. But remember that your comments may be used on the air.
It's the good, the bad, and the very, very eulotritiously ugly. The good. Aung San Suu Kyi. Kyi, the opposition leader in Myanmar, also known as Burma, won a seat in that country's parliament following Sunday's election. Kyi's party, the National League for Democracy, is trying to win 45 seats in the election, and the fact that Kyi won marked a major victory for many in the country who have lived under military rule for the past 5 decades. Despite wide-ranging reports of voter irregularities and voter fraud, it appears Kyi and Myanmar, Burma, have started the journey to democracy without a U.S.-led war to force it on them. The bad. Texas Governor Rick Perry. Rick Perry and Texas are full steam ahead in executing another potentially innocent death row inmate. Gene Will was arrested for killing a deputy sheriff in 2000, but there's a great deal of evidence to suggest that he's innocent. Will is in a process of appealing to the courts. Not sure, though, that he'll get through it before they put him to death. Since Rick Perry became governor, 235 prisoners have been executed, many with very questionable convictions. It's time Texas and the rest of this country stop the death penalty and the injustices that go along with it. And the very, very ugly, the Arizona Superintendent of Schools, John Huppenthal. 2 years ago, Arizona banned the teaching of ethnic studies in K-12 education, and now they're going after universities, too. Huppenthal said that suspended ethnic studies classes, for example, like ones on Mexican-American relations, teach students to resent whites, and the university programs that educate public school teachers are to blame. He went on to say, I think that's where this toxic thing starts, from the universities. To me, the pervasive problem was a lack of balance going on in those classes. This has nothing to do with teaching students to hate whites and everything to do with Arizona's all-out assault on immigrants from south of the border, and it is very, very ugly. On Sunday night, someone walked up to a Planned Parenthood clinic in Grand Chute, Wisconsin, and detonated a homemade explosive device outside a window. Luckily, no one was inside the clinic at the time, so no one was injured. Wisconsin, like a number of other states under the control of Republican state legislatures, is currently in the midst of a heated debate over abortion. And that rhetoric could have turned the war on women hot, leading to some less than stable religious warrior to attack the Planned Parenthood clinic. We don't know for sure what happened yet, as the police are continuing their investigation. But you probably haven't heard much about this story, have you? That's because it's received virtually no coverage from the mainstream corporate media. But had that clinic been a church or a government building, and had that bomb maker been wearing a turban or been a member of the New Black Panthers, then you can bet it would have received wall-to-wall media attention, especially at Fox so-called News. The word terrorism has been plastered, would have been plastered under breaking news graphics on televisions all across America. But this act of terrorism, presumably committed by a white Christian? Not so much. So why is that? It's because of the way the fear machine in America works. This is the fear machine in America. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry that makes tremendous profits by scaring Americans to death about everything from Muslims to undocumented immigrants to the national debt. It gets flipped on whenever it's convenient to whip up fear in America, like whenever Americans need to be scared about the deficit and convinced to support austerity measures or profitization of the social safety net. Let's just give Social Security off to Wall Street. With Muslims in particular, this fear machine is incredibly effective. The Center for American Progress recently uncovered a network of right-wing organizations that are bankrolling a $42 million Islamophobia fear machine that serves only one purpose: make us all scared to death of Muslims. So back in 2010, when a Muslim organization tried to build a community center in Lower Manhattan, the fear machine was turned on full power, and the fearmongers went to work on places like Fox so-called News.
Do I want 560 feet away from where a lot of my friends died and I lived and I worked, do I want a mosque that may be a meeting place for some of the scariest minds, some of the biggest terrorist minds?
The reason the Muslim community is the radical Muslim community is so anxious for this thing to be built is because they want to counter the assimilationist tendencies of Muslims in the United States.
Oh, of course they do.
And then someone flipped the switch on again to scare Americans into thinking, Sharia laws on the march, they're taking over America.
as more Muslims move into the West, you see an increase in honor killings. They are rampant in Europe, certainly increased dramatically in Canada, and now here. I mean, how many girls have to die?
Where are we in relationship to that? Have we allowed it? Have we embraced it? Are they actually starting to live by Sharia law within our own U.S. law?
Be afraid! Be very afraid! But the real purpose of the fear machine is not just to make Americans scared to death of anyone wearing a turban, but also to generate massive profits for certain industries that depend on fear. From defense contractors who are making billions off the never-ending war on terror, to security contractors who are making billions off Cherto X-ray porno scanners in our airports, to Islamophobes who are making money off TV appearances, books, and lectures, the fear machine is generating enormous fortunes for those who are banking on Americans being afraid of Muslims. Not to mention the political benefits the Republican Party receives when Americans hit the polls and vote based on fear. So when a Planned Parenthood clinic gets bombed in Wisconsin, there's a real simple reason why that fear machine isn't fired up. There's no money to be made, no political points to be scored. No one wants to install porno scanners in Planned Parenthood clinics. No one stands to profit from a never-ending war against Christian extremism. And Republicans don't win elections by defending Planned Parenthood. So the fear machine falls silent, and the brazen attack on women's reproductive rights is ignored. We Americans go about our day as if everything is fine, at least until the fear machine gets rebooted. When a Muslim does something, or an African American does something, it can be spun into a threat. Our nation was not conceived in fear. We stared down the greatest military in the world and won our independence from the British. We were a nation that in the midst of the Great Depression, one of the worst economic catastrophes that we've ever seen, we were told that we have nothing to fear but fear itself by President Franklin Roosevelt. And without any fear, we beat back Hitler in Europe and the Japanese in the Pacific during World War II. We are not the fearful nation that fear machine wants us to think that we are. It's time we acknowledge what's happening in America and take a sledgehammer to that fear machine that is manipulating all of us and turning us into lunatics over fake threats while having us ignore the actual threats against America. Threats like the destruction of the middle class, the war against women. You know, we used to be the land of the free and the home of the brave, and we can be that way again if we'll just call out the fear machine. That's it for the big picture tonight. Don't forget, democracy begins with you. Get out there and get active. Tag. You're it. See you tomorrow.